Hi everybody, I am Jessica Price and I'm here to talk to you about how not to get stuck in a toxic working situation. I hate going after Kate, like it always sends my imposter syndrome into overdrive, but I'll try and dovetail it. The thing is, I don't really want to be here. I mean, I'm glad to be in Visby, it's beautiful, I'm glad, the jury stuff has been wonderful, but I would like to be here to talk to you about cutting-edge game design. I would like to be here to talk to you about story. I've been paid to write since I was in 7th grade, and I'm actually pretty good at it and feel like I have a lot of stuff to teach in that regard. It sucks to be kind of famous for having had something terrible happen to you, but it's really important to me to make sure that people know what they're getting into going into this industry and that they are prepared to defend themselves. So I kept revising this talk. Like at first it was like a parade of horror stories, like you should know how bad this is. When I was at GDC a few years ago, I actually got into it with a professor because he had been talking about his game writing program and was really proud of the fact that it was 50% female. And so I asked him, okay, well, what are you doing to prepare all of your students, but especially women, because these things hit women harder, what are you doing to prepare them for the meat grinder of an industry that they're going into? And he was like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, Gamergate, terrible working conditions, people's health being destroyed by working in this industry. And he was like, I don't know what you mean. And my thought was, then you're not qualified to be teaching if you can't be realistic about this. But then I decided that was too depressing. So then I thought about theory, let's talk about management theory, and because hopefully some of you are going to be managers at some point, and you should be thinking about it from the moment you begin your career. What happens when I'm in charge of other people? But that got a little too heady, so I decided to go with something really pragmatic. And I think this is really important because people keep asking me, why do you keep blowing your life up over video games? They're just games. And like Kate was talking about, it's a huge industry financially, but just as importantly, this is going to be a little US-centric, but each generation has their dominant narrative form, right? For the greatest generation, it was movies. For boomers, it was TV. For us, it's video games. And stories are incredibly important. People name their children, they shape their lives, they kill, they die for stories. And so what I keep wondering is, the responsibility of the storyteller isn't just to warn us what we should be afraid of or what we need to fight, it's also to expand what we can imagine and what we can hope. And what happens when the people in charge of creating the stories that are the dominant narrative form for our generation don't have any hope anymore? Because that's what's happening in this industry, right? I got into it because I wanted to tell cool stories and I wanted to help people play. And then I started asking myself, why is doing this so miserable? Why are none of us having any fun making stuff that is supposed to help people have fun? So, sorry, kind of a long introduction, but this is going to be very pragmatic, but remember that behind this, there is that larger point of, we've got to find a way to not have making games kill people, make them miserable, because deaths have happened, right? I mean, it's destroying people's health, and it's destroying people's relationships, and it's just not okay. So, I also just, out of curiosity, I think this is going to be a generational thing. How many of you recognize the movie reference in this title slide? Oh, good. Way better than I was hoping, or way better than I was afraid of. For those who don't, this is a still from the movie The Never-Ending Story. This is the Swamp of Sadness scene in which there is a swamp that makes everybody who goes into it despair, and this is visualized by them sinking deeper and deeper into the swamp. This is the scene where the hero's horse actually gets super sad and dies. It's a really harsh movie for kids. So, the 40-hour work week comes from the philosophy of every week you have 40 hours of sleep, 40 hours of work, and 40 hours of leisure. So, you're going to be spending half of your waking hours, at minimum, at your job. Are you okay with 50% of your time being miserable? If you said yes to that, please reconsider how much you value yourself as a human being. So there have been a ton of articles about this. It's not just games. And again, this is US-centric. You guys have more protections. But as Kate was talking about, we're a global society, right? and companies in the US, or companies outside the US see what companies in the US are getting away with, it's going to start eroding people's rights elsewhere. And it's real bad. So workplace culture in general is terrible, but in the US especially, games are really bad because they're seen as a prestige industry. You know, like Kate was talking about, for most of the jobs I've had, they've told me that there were like 300 applicants for my position. And so the attitude always is, well, if you don't like these working conditions, we can find 300 other people who would kill to replace you. You keep getting told, make your passion your day job and you'll never work a day in your life. Well, tie your income to your passion in an abusive workplace and you will come to hate the thing you once loved. And we don't want that to happen. So, a bit about me. Who am I? I'm a writer, I've been a producer, I've been a game designer, I've been a marketer, I've directed and wrote and produced an animated series that tied into a game, many, many things. But apparently lately I'm famous for being fired. I was fired in 2011 from Microsoft Game Studios when the new manager of our department managed to push out a woman he really didn't like and then fired basically everybody she'd hired. Should have seen it coming at that point. 2012, I had gone back to Microsoft, foolishly, reported a male coworker for sexual harassment after he began sending me photographs of my apartment and talking about murder-suicides because I wouldn't date him. And Microsoft told me basically, well, you know, we can fire him, but you are one of 2 women on this 40-person team. How do you think your male colleagues are going to feel about you if you are the woman who got a guy fired for sexual harassment? So probably you would just be better off finding another company. 2017, I was fired from Paizo, the makers of the Pathfinder role-playing game, because after a guy who had been warned about 5 years ago, don't be around him when he's drunk, he gets handsy. Every year he picks a woman, harasses her for the entire convention. The final year I was there, a woman came to another female co-worker and was like, I think I've been roofied, and this guy won't leave me alone, and I'm disoriented, don't know what to do. We tried to help her. The company was basically like, well, since she doesn't want the police involved, you should just stay out of it. We didn't. A coworker, or a woman on my team got physically injured, dislocated her shoulder, literally physically pulling the guy off as victim. The company refused to treat it as a workplace injury. She was like, hey, will you come with me to ask them to reconsider that because I'm scared to go alone. I ended up being like, hey, unless you get rid of this guy and prevent him from coming to future company events, I will not be attending any of those events. They fired me. And in 2018, most famously, I was fired from ArenaNet, makers of Guild Wars 2, for telling a man basically to stop telling me how to do my job. My coworker, incidentally, was fired for pointing out that that harassment was actually gendered because it wasn't happening to him and he was talking about the same stuff. So, things I have been told in response to raising issues at work. When I was being sexually harassed and threatened by a coworker, took it to my manager, the first response was, well, you do smile at him a lot. When I went to the CEO of a company I worked for and was like, hey, our developers, who are each line managers, are being paid less than half and actually closer to a third of what the living wage is in Seattle. She was like, well, they should be glad to have a job here at all because there are tons of people who would love to work on this game for free. And when I brought up that I had been groped at a company convention and that we didn't have good reporting procedures for handling that sort of thing, I was told, well, you're there to make sure that they have a good time, as if being groped was part of my job. So all of these things were giant red flags. In none of these jobs did I quit or walk out, threaten to bring legal action or anything. I really should have, because they were signs it was about to get worse. So let's talk about some red flags. I've left out a lot of things that are ambiguous. Some of these are going to be really obvious to you. Some of them are going to be things that actually look like kindness when you started a company, right? They look positive. There's a lot of stuff I left out. Like at this point, I'm really suspicious when I walk into a company and they have a ton of recreational stuff in the office, right? Like a ton of foosball tables, a big lounge for playing video games, because my first question is always, do you allow people to do this stuff? Do you encourage them to do it on the clock? Because if you don't, then it looks to me like they're trying to keep you here longer at the office, basically. They're trying to make it so you don't want to go home. That's a problem. So first, let's talk about toxic company behaviors. The biggest one is bad management philosophies. Employees versus management. Early on at my job in Paizo, we had, for our yearly reviews, 3 top-tier positives and 3 top-tier negatives, right? So like the 3 things over the past year that you'd done that the company thought was really outstanding, and the 3 things that you'd done that they thought were the biggest problems. And my first top-tier negative was, seems to be more of an employee advocate than a company advocate. And my initial response is, the company's goals and desires and the workers' goals and desires should have like a 90% overlap, right? We both want to make a good game, we both want it to sell well. And that 10% difference should largely be over salary and benefits, right? Like we're always going to want more than they want to give us. So it's a big warning sign when the company views your interests as largely in opposition to theirs. Parent-child metaphors. It's really insulting. Your manager is not your parent, and that tells you something about how they think of you as employees. You're not children. Your manager isn't your parent. You are not dependent on them. They don't know better than you do about everything. It's a really scary metaphor. And these family metaphors. This company is a family, right? Like, oh, here we go. I was going to put a video in, and then I was worried about it actually working. These are stills from a series called Sports Night. And when Kate was talking about Americans being proud of how hard we work, like I grew up on Aaron Sorkin series, like Sports Night and The West Wing, which are always about these cool teams of people that love each other and are working on something super important. They want to be there around the clock, because they don't want a life outside of work because their job is so great, right? So in the pilot for Sports Night, it's about a behind the scenes of making this like sports news show. So they have a really bad night, and the studio head, who is the gentleman in these screenshots, is like, I'm thinking of firing the whole lot of you. And Felicity Huffman's character, who's the executive producer, is like, yeah, you won't though, because like we're all family here and you think of me as a daughter. And he's like, no, we're a television show, and I think you are very much an employee to me. And it's played for laughs, but I'm like, that's actually a healthy working relationship. Family metaphors, it's like most of the people in my life that I'm not related to that I consider family, I met at jobs. There's nothing wrong with developing really close friendships with your coworkers and coming to view them as family. There is something wrong when management keeps telling you that the company is your family, because they're not, right? They do not have your best interests in mind. They exist to make money. That family metaphor stuff is really manipulative, and it ties into like trying to guilt you about working longer hours and about putting the company's interests ahead of your own. So what are some healthy alternatives to these conceptions of what management and worker relationships should be? Well, as a manager, I always say, I'm basically an air traffic controller. My job is to have more context than the people on my team, right? Context that most of the time they don't have to be bothered with. They need to focus on what they're doing. They need to focus on producing the product that they're producing. As a manager, I want them to do what I tell them, not because they think I'm smarter than they are, not because they think I'm a superior human being, but because I will stop them from crashing into things, because I can see that wider context. And the other metaphor I like is we are a team of superheroes, right? Management is one skill set among many other skill sets. Everybody on your team is an expert. Like, if you know how to do the job of everybody on your team better than they do, you have not hired the right people, right? Like, everybody should individually know the most about doing what they do. Your job should mainly be to get them to work together well. You see this a lot when companies promote like the best programmer to run the programming team. At that point, all you've done is lost your best programmer, because being a good manager and being a good programmer are two completely different skill sets. So you want a team of superheroes. Another big red flag is loyalty culture. Yeah, like in an ideal world, your company treats you really well and you're loyal because you believe in the work that you're doing and you appreciate how they're treating you, and you're all working together, you're a team. they don't get to demand it of you, right? If they're punishing people for pointing out problems, like this is my career. I spent 5 years at Pfizer trying to stop this company from getting sued, and every time I came to them and was like, you were doing a thing that could get you sued, they would act like, not like I was pointing out an existing problem, but that I was creating the problem by pointing it out. There is no greater loyalty than to go to your management and be like, hey, I've found a problem, let's fix it before the public finds out, right? So if your company is punishing you for that, that's a huge red flag. Treating former employees as enemies. I used to be at a company where they would, every year, read the names of everybody in the credits, and then anybody who'd left the company, the CEO would want people to like boo them. Why? Like, your company should largely, if you don't want to be there and you want to go on and find another job, I'm not saying they have to be happy about that, but that should not be a reason for them to resent you. And playing employees against each other. When I was at Microsoft, they kind of wanted us to like inform on each other, like who isn't working hard enough. And this was during the heyday of stack ranking, which was this really, really terrible review structure where basically you had to fire, I think, 10% of the team every year, whether or not, I mean, if you had a team of superstars, you were still supposed to pick a person and fire them. So there was this like very big brother culture of like, you're not supposed to credit people on other teams if they help you because you're actually competing with them, and just, you don't want to see, the enemy should be the passage of time, right? The enemy should be, we've got to get a lot of work done in this short period of time. It should not be each other. Healthy alternatives, actually recognizing employees who come to you with problems as the canary in the coal mine. I don't know if you're familiar with this metaphor, but basically miners used to take canaries down into the mines with them because they are small, and if there were poisonous gases down there, the canary would keel over a long time before the miner. And nowadays, very tellingly, we seem to use that term for people who aren't listened to, right? Which is backwards. Like, the whole reason you have a canary is to let you know so you don't get hurt. People who are marginalized in some way tend to be the canary in the coal mine at workplaces because they're the first ones that bad policies, toxic culture and stuff affect. So like, listen to the people who aren't happy. And then also, you know, this next picture is a king and his advisor. Like, if your management should be treating you as their advisors, right? Like the experts that are telling them. Like, because if you're making games, right, you are probably a gamer. You know, you were probably somebody who got into this because you really enjoyed playing games. And especially you guys, when you get into the workforce, when you're new, a lot of times you have your finger more on the pulse of what players want, because the dirty secret of the game industry is like, once you get into it and start making games, you barely have any time to play games. So like, if your management isn't listening to you and isn't respecting the fact that you know what you're doing, that's a huge red flag. Ego above all. If your company has superstars, if they have certain employees who the company is trying to make into celebrities, but they're not offering opportunities for other people to get into that, right? If they have a Twitch stream and it's always the same people on it, and lower level employees never get a chance to like speak to the public or be on the Twitch stream or do interviews or, you know, be seen as experts, that's a huge problem. Language in job postings and company culture stuff, like we're rock stars, we're looking for rock stars. It's like, rock star is not actually a flattering metaphor for an employee, right? Like, rock stars are people who like may be super talented but also trash hotel rooms. That suggests that they're going to support bad behavior by people they view as more talented than other people. And here's the thing, like, there is no reason to put up with the genius asshole. I know that we have all these television shows, we got Sherlock Holmes usually portrayed as this genius asshole, but the thing is, there are people who are just as good who aren't assholes, so supporting the like, this guy's a rock star, so we gotta, I mean, that's what's going on at Riot, right? And then the management knows best idea, right? Like, I'm a manager, therefore I know more about everything than you do. Again, it gets back into that. The healthy alternative is to see your team as a team of superheroes where everybody's an expert. And everybody deserves a chance to, if the company is going to promote anybody's personal brand, everybody should have that opportunity. Preying on passion. I get really nervous anytime management talks about anybody's passion but their own, right? Because like, this is at the crux of why the industry is so abusive. Most of us get into this because we are very passionate and because we really care about what we're making. We want to make it good. We love what we're doing. We're willing to work those longer hours. We're willing to say, like, okay, you know what, the working conditions here are not ideal. The way that my manager treats me is not great, but like, I want to make games, right? Don't let them use that as an excuse to abuse you. You should be happy to work here. Don't let your team down. That's a really scary one, right? Like, we talk about working extra hours as bad project management. It is, and they should not be telling you, like, you don't get to go home because if you do, you're gonna let your team down. That's their problem, not yours. Lots of overtime. And then a big one, I mean, this is largely what I got fired over, is treating creatives as customer service reps and hidden job responsibilities that are not in your job description. So almost every company I've worked at, except Microsoft, has had a requirement that devs interact with fans. And fans tend to treat that as, well, devs are basically functioning as customer service, right? I'm a creative. My job description is not to make an individual customer happy. And like, I want to preface this with nobody should abuse customer service reps either, but part of their job description is literally trying to make individual customers, often who are not happy, right? That's not what creatives do. And so if there is a requirement, implicit or explicit, that you are going to interact with the public, and the company doesn't have, if that's not explicit in the job description and they don't have protections for you, that's a huge problem. It's a huge drain, right? Because fans can be awful. Healthy alternatives, good project management, and clearly laid out policies that are explicit about what you're expected to do. And you can always question policies. Like, never forget that if something in the employee handbook seems, read the employee handbook. If something in the employee handbook seems off, like, you can actually take that up with your manager. And I've, like, in your employment contract too, I've literally, before signing contracts, crossed out sections. It always surprises the company, but a lot of times they don't fight it. If the company doesn't care about your future, this is a huge issue, right? If there are no defined career paths to, like, in 10 years, if I'm still here, what am I going to be doing? And how is it going to be better than what I'm doing now? If they're not helping you build your resume, like, it's really scary to me when I work at a company that has different job titles than everywhere else in the industry. Now, I mean, to a certain extent, every company defines their job titles uniquely, but, if you're, a big thing was, like, at Paizo, they referred to the people who were essentially the product managers for product lines as developers. Well, that means something completely different if they ever wanted to leave tabletop gaming. Nobody knows what a developer in tabletop is. It means something completely different in video games. It means something completely different in software. And so people were not getting clearly defined job responsibilities or clearly defined job titles that would help them build your resume. And no employee ownership. I was just talking to Kate backstage when we got the question about, like, well, we need crunch, right, to get these games done. If we don't crunch, we won't get the game made, nobody will make any money. And I'm like, okay, well, if you want me to crunch, give me partial ownership in the company. I will crunch till dawn on something that, if it succeeds, I'm going to have my retirement set. But if there's no employee ownership, if there aren't bonuses based on the company's profitability, if there's not stock, if there's not some way in which the company's profitability directly and proportionately reimburses you, then the company is not actually caring for your future as an employee. Healthy alternatives, a big part of it is give me money, enable me to make money, enable me, if I go on to a career at another company, to succeed there, like, train me, do things that are going to enable me to actually have earning power. Setting you up to fail is a big one. I hate the term culture fit. Anytime I see it, it's a huge red flag, because generally what that means is this is basically a frat house, and if you don't fit into that narrow band of who it's okay to be, you're just not going to succeed here. It's usually used as an excuse to fire or not promote or stifle the careers of anybody who doesn't fit that narrow stereotype of what a game developer is. Vague or anonymous feedback, if you're getting things like, yeah, well, you're abrasive in meetings. What does that actually mean? Like, there's actually a New York Times article about how for women, we get terms like abrasive versus men tend to get concrete feedback, like you did this specific thing in meetings and it was bad. But anytime that your review has feedback that you can't act on, how are you supposed to improve? Lack of transparency. If you don't understand what the company's policies are, if you don't understand where the company's financials are, if you don't understand what their management philosophies are, that's a big problem, right? Because that's information that you need to know to thrive there. The requirement to advance is a thing that has always weirded me out. There's this philosophy that if you're not being constantly promoted and constantly getting more responsibility at the company, you're failing. And I'm always like, in industries outside games and tech, you have these people, like at a law firm, you have these legal secretaries who have been in their position for 30 years and are the keepers of institutional knowledge that helps the company function. And were they to have to become paralegals or become lawyers, the company would actually lose that institutional knowledge. And there is nothing wrong with, I am good at this thing, and I want to continue getting better at this thing, but I don't want to be a manager. I don't have that skill set. I don't want that skill set. That's not what I want to do. And so if there's this requirement that you keep getting promoted into management positions, otherwise you're failing, that tells me that the company is a churn and burn company, right, that is looking to go through a lot of employees quickly. And I don't think it's healthy. And the other thing is lack of reciprocity. Every time I read an employee handbook, it's usually, what is the employee supposed to do? And not, what will the company do for me? Right? So I want to know, if you have a social media policy that says that I can't talk about certain things on social media, well, okay, what if in the course of doing my job and interacting with the public in the way that you demand that I do everything right and I still get harassed because I'm a woman, or because they didn't like a decision that the company made, and I'm a game designer, so therefore I must be responsible for it, and now people are sending me death threats. What is the company going to do to protect me? If the employee handbook says I'm supposed to report sexual harassment, well, okay, what is the policy going to be when I report it? What is the, not just what do I need to do, but what will the company response be? If they're not willing to meet you halfway, that basically says to me that all of the requirements are on you, and they're just going to decide kind of ad hoc whether you're doing it correctly. Healthy alternatives actually have clear measurements for what does success look like here? Does it involve having to keep getting promoted? What is the company policy, and what does that actually mean for what the company is going to do? Just clear, transparent metrics and policies. You also need to trust your own feelings. So I'm gonna, because I don't want to, that was pretty long, I'm gonna go through this fairly quickly, but here are some personal signs that the company you're working for is maybe pretty toxic. If your coworkers are talking about how much they hate the company or management constantly, that's a problem. If you have to keep telling yourself, and this is always where, I have too much hope. Each time I get a job, I hope this is going to be the one, this is going to be my career, this is going to be a company that respects and values me, and we're going to have a great long relationship. And then, usually somewhere about 6 months in, I find myself just telling myself, this is fine, no, this is okay, as stuff happens around me. If you have to keep repeating to yourself, no, this is fine, I'm okay with this, I can survive this, whatever, it's probably time to get out. If you don't feel safe collaborating or asking for help or admitting that you don't know something, that's the biggest one for me. It takes a lot of courage to admit that you don't know something, just like it takes a lot of courage to go to management and be like, I found a problem. And that courage should be rewarded rather than punished, right? If you admit, I don't know how to do this, the response shouldn't be well, then you're incompetent. It should be oh, okay, well, we didn't train you correctly then. Here's what you need to do. Or even, okay, well, this is a new responsibility. Here is what you need to do. Here are the metrics for success. Here's somebody to help you navigate this. If the only time anybody asks hard questions is at lunch, nobody does it when there are managers around, that's a bad sign. If you don't know what the company's leadership philosophy is, if they're not clearly articulating, these are our goals, these are the goals for management, these are the goals for the entire company, why aren't they? Like, that's my biggest question with a lot of this, is like, why won't you tell us this stuff? If you don't know what success looks like, right? If you don't know, what do I need to be doing to succeed? If it's this sort of vague, like, well, that person, everybody thinks they're doing a good job, and like they're clearly on the track to promotion, but I don't know what they're doing that's different from what I'm doing, and I don't know who to ask. I don't know how to find this out. You know, that's a lot of times a sign of that like superstar culture. If you wake up in the morning and you dread going to work, like we all have days, right? Even the best job in the world, some days is just going to be a job, right? And there are going to be days where it's like, you know, we have this deadline to meet. Today's going to be a long day. I'm not looking forward to this. But if every morning you get up and you're like, oh man, I wish I didn't have to go to work, it is time to leave. If you only stay because you're afraid you won't be able to get another job. Like, look, I've been fired and laid off so many times, and I keep getting jobs, right? Like, if you succeed, you know, you graduate with a degree from one of these programs, you are talented, you wouldn't be here if you weren't passionate, you have what it takes to succeed. I mean, whether there are enough jobs is a separate issue, but like, once you get into the industry, once you get, you know, a few years of working in games under your belt, you can usually get out and go into non-games tech, where like you will have better working hours and be paid better. So you shouldn't stay at it. I know this is hard, and I know this seems like, well, I'm lucky to get a job at all, but you should not stay at a job just because you're afraid you won't be able to get another one. And sometimes like taking that first step is just being like, okay, I'm gonna work on my resume, right? And you know, I'm gonna take an interview just for practice. But like, you're not as trapped as you feel. Trust me on this one. If you don't expect your manager to tell you the truth, right? If you know that they're going to give you some kind of management bullshit, if you can't close the door and get them to level with you, that is a sign that, you know, the transparency needs to go all the way to the top, but it needs to start with your manager. And if they're afraid to tell you the truth, something is probably seriously wrong. And if you never get asked for your input, because every single person at a company has something to contribute, right? Like, the best companies I've been at, we had creative brainstorms in the lunchroom that involved the office manager and, like, in one case, the custodian. And they actually had, like, really fresh perspectives, and we're like, well, what if you tried this? And we're all like, oh, that's a really good idea. So the company should constantly be soliciting your input, not just creatively, even if you're not a creative. Like, look, at the end of the day, there's a creative director, and it is their job to, like, be the ones who decide, but that doesn't mean that other people can't give input. So if you're never getting asked for your input, if the company is not checking with you to be like, hey, are you happy in your job? How can we improve? If they don't want to hear from you, that's not a good sign. So most of you are students. Most of you have not actually had your first job in games yet, I assume, and so everything I've been talking about is once you're already there. But how do you, when you're looking for a job, screen for, like, is this somewhere that I'm going to be miserable 6 months from now? This is not a complete list of interview questions, and a lot of this is, you know, how to shape these questions is kind of something that you do in the moment and in the flow of the interview, but this, what I'm going to give you is a list of sample questions that you can use, and you can ask variants of them. You can use them to sort of target the interview to what you want to find out. So, what are the criteria for success in this job? They should be able to tell you in the interview, what do I need to do for the company to be happy with my performance 1 year from now? In this first year, what are the criteria for success? And they should be clear, they should be concrete, they shouldn't be vague stuff like, you need to stand out, you need to take responsibility. They need to actually be like, this is what you need to do. You need to have brought this project in on time. You need to have designed a level of this game yourself. You know, similar to that is, how will I know how I'm doing? And if you are surprised in your review, you know, you have usually most companies have a yearly or a twice-a-year review. If stuff is coming up that's surprising you, that's a problem, right? You should not be surprised by the feedback you're getting. That should basically be an actual review of the year, like, you know, okay, well, you know, you knew you were struggling on this, and like you've improved in this way, or you haven't improved. But nothing in that should ambush you, because if it is, then your manager has not been doing their job. They haven't been communicating clearly with you. When an employee raises an issue, what happens? Both what is the procedure, and also like, how does management typically respond to an employee raising an issue? What is the company's management philosophy? If everybody that you talk to can't articulate that, that's a bad sign, right? People need to know, what is this company's, how does this company function? What is the management philosophy? What does success look like for the company? What are the criteria for promoting somebody to be a manager? Because as I keep mentioning, managing is a completely different skill set from everything else. It is a skill set in and of itself. It is unrelated to how good you are at being an individual contributor. And if the company doesn't recognize that that's a separate skill set, you get into that, like, you promote the best programmer to manage the programmers, and now you've lost the work of your best programmer and have somebody who is probably not going to be good at managing in charge. Similarly, what training do managers get? If the company, when they promote somebody, does not give them concrete education on how to manage, that's a huge problem. And unfortunately, because games are so sort of the Wild West, they promote people all the time. Like, every time I've been promoted to be a manager, I've gotten 0 training. And in every case, I've requested it, and in a lot of cases, I've gotten the company to start instituting it for the people who come after me. But like, most of the time, they just put you in charge of a team, and they maybe give you, training on how to do reviews, but that's not management. What happens if I can't get my work done in a 40-hour work week? So like, look, sometimes people are not good at their jobs, right? Sometimes people don't know how to manage their time well. But in every case, the first response to that needs to not be blaming the employee. It needs to be giving them tools to manage their time better. And most of the time, if you can't get your job done in a 40-hour work week, the project management is failing. And like, look, there are emergencies, things come up. And so there are, at least in the culture we're currently working with, there are always going to be times where it's like, okay, we got hacked and our internet was down for a week. So we need everybody to work a little bit harder because this is an emergency. But if you're starting out with having more work than you can do in a 40-hour week, you don't have a release valve for when things go wrong. How does management fit into the team? Again, like, how do the managers see themselves? How does everybody see the manager? If it is that whole, like, well, they're in charge, they're the expert, that's a problem. If the manager isn't seen, if the manager is seen as above the team rather than part of the team, that's a problem. Because again, as a manager, like, a big part of what you're doing is managing context and managing how much context the people on your team have to know and worry about. How will this job help build my career, right? Like, it's fine to be like, I hope that this company becomes my career. I hope I can stay here for many years and be happy here and that you're happy with me. But assuming that, I have to leave, or the company goes under, or you cut my department, or whatever, like, how will having been here help me get another job? What are the biggest challenges facing the team is, like, I don't care what you're interviewing for, I don't care if it's your first position, that is something that you need to know going in. And with all of these, like, pay attention to how they answer, right? Like, it's okay if they, like, have to think about it for a bit, but, like, if they can't articulately answer these questions, this means that either they're not informed or they're afraid to tell you, which is a red flag. And I love asking people, when you have disagreed with a management decision, what did you do and what happened? And, again, if they're hesitant to tell you, that's probably a sign that the relationship between management and employees isn't good. So, is it ever worth it to work at a toxic company? I would say yes, with some really strong caveats. Like, sometimes it's worth it to get a thing on your resume. It's usually not worth it to stay. Most of the time, you're not going to be able to fix it. And like, thinking that you can fix it is the thing that keeps us all there for years, while it destroys our health, while it destroys our relationship, while it destroys our hope. Because like, we keep having hope that we can fix it, we'll make it better. We'll just get through this project, and then we'll readdress how project management works. We'll just get through this project, and then we'll readdress morale. We just need to ship this thing, and then we'll address everything that's wrong. And like, I gotta tell you, addressing what's wrong almost never happens, because again, you ship a thing and you're immediately onto DLC. You're immediately onto the next game because you need to keep producing for the company to keep functioning. So as hard as it is to accept, unless it's your company or you're like a C-level executive, you're not going to fix it. The main thing to know if you decide, like, this is something that I want on my resume, is you need to have a very clear agreement with yourself about, all right, when do I leave? Am I going to stay here for a year? Am I going to stay here until I ship this one game? Am I going to stay here until I get promoted so that I can have that promotion on my resume? But know what your criteria are, and you also need to know what your criteria for, even if I don't get to that point, what constitutes bad enough that I'm not going to put up with it anymore. And like, you need to promise yourself, if this happens, you know, if these things don't happen, I'm going to immediately start looking for another job. So, Q&A. Just a caveat, the Q stands for question. You know, if you go for more than like 2 or 3 sentences without asking a question, I'm going to cut you off, because, you know, if you want to give your own talk, get a public speaking gig or make a YouTube video, but, you know, everybody's here to ask questions, so thanks.
Should be on. Hey, thank you very much for the talk. I have a follow-up question regarding the lack of reciprocity that you mentioned before. A lot of the tools that you mentioned that would give us an insight about whether or not it fits ourselves are from the inside, as like if you're already an employee. Having worked in PR, I'm very wary of everything that's being posted by the company itself, so I'm wondering, what would you suggest we use in order to get an insight into these practices if we don't know anybody that's already in the company?
A lot of times I ask for a copy of the employee handbook during the interview, or even ahead of time. Sometimes they're not willing to give you that because there's confidential information in it, but even so, they should be able to, you know, tell you what the policies are. You know, sometimes I'll be like, hey, can you bring a copy so you can at least like look at it and read to me the parts that don't have anything confidential in them in the interview. So I will ask ahead of time, like ask the recruiter to make sure that somebody during my interview loop has a copy of the handbook. You know, for most of it, they shouldn't be afraid to tell you what's in there.
All right, great, thank you.
Certainly.
Hello, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your talk. It's been really interesting. As a woman who's just coming into the industry, you also mentioned like that sometimes companies can have something akin to a frat culture almost.
Yep.
Is there any way to spot it, or like to know like how to minimize your chances as a female game developer to,
yeah, so I could give a whole second talk on this. A big part of it is we know that culture change happens when the team is around 30% women, right? So the best advice I have for women, and like, to be really frank, I stopped taking female mentees because mostly I was like, any other industry, get out, get out, get out. It's not worth it. You know, it's really bad at most companies. But the thing I always say is, you need your own personal board of directors. Like, if you became CEO of your company, who would the people that you want running it with you be? You find those people, and people who are new to the industry a lot of times make the mistake of like focusing on sucking up to people who are above them. No, focus on forming relationships with their peers. Because here's the thing, I don't need anything from you. Like, there's probably nothing you can do to help my career, right? So, like, absolutely try and have a good relationship with people who can be mentors to you, but focus mostly on your peers, because they're the ones who you're going to be coming up through the industry with. If you help somebody who is another student now, you know, if you save their ass on a project, if you're the one whose shoulder they cry on when stuff is tough, or if you're the one who just gives them good advice, if you find a good company and go back to your classmates and are like, hey, I found someone really good and they're hiring, and help them get a job, you don't know, 10 years from now they might be a CEO and they're going to hire you, right? Like, you don't know. And I know that this sounds like a little like manipulative or Machiavellian, but like, it's also to me the ethical thing to do is to support your peers. And like, when I got fired from ArenaNet, other women in the industry, and it usually wasn't women who run their own company. There were a few of them, but it was mostly women at the same level I'm at, women who I started my career with, started sending me money, right? And I didn't ask. They just found out what my email for my PayPal was. And that means so much, and I hadn't realized, like, I felt like I hadn't done anything for anybody other than like speak up about issues, but then like I would get notes like, oh yeah, well, I was scared to interview at this company and you gave me a pep talk, or you recommended me for this job, and all this stuff that I didn't even remember doing, but other people remembered. And so when I needed help, like all of a sudden, you know, people were randomly sending me $250 on PayPal, which matters when you're unemployed. So focus on building a really tight network of peers, and then take over. If you get to a company, and if you manage to get promoted into a management position, hire people you know have the same ethics that you do, that care about the same issues, and that really care about making the workplace better for everybody. You know, like, we need to unionize. It's the only way that things are going to get better on a large scale. But collective action isn't just unionization, and it isn't just formal organizations. It's also just having each other's backs, and it's not being willing to, you know, kowtow to management at the expense of your peers. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Thank you so much.
for sure.
Hi.
Hi.
Excellent talk.
Oh, thank you.
I was wondering, so I think the part about interview questions was very interesting. Most of my interviews I had before were unqualified work, service industry, stuff like this. It seems like a lot of these would require a lot of self-awareness and honesty that a for-profit organization just would never be able to muster. Is there a trick to get honest answers to this? I feel like any of these questions I would just get lied to, basically.
I'm sorry, I couldn't make out your question.
Sorry, is there, in practice, in the industry, will you get an honest answer to these interview questions? Because it doesn't feel like
And I just remembered I'm supposed to be repeating the question. So with those interview questions, will you get honest answers? A lot of times you won't in what they're saying, in the actual words that they say, but watching people's reactions, right? Like, you know, you don't have to be like an expert psychologist, but I would read up on, you know, recognizing like unconscious reactions. I've done a lot of reading on, you know, body language and what that indicates. And so mostly what I look for when I ask these questions isn't necessarily the words that they are going to tell me in the answer, it's how they're reacting to being asked the question. Because if it scares them, if they're uncomfortable, you know, if their face closes down, that's usually a sign that the company doesn't have an open culture of talking about this stuff.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello, and thank you so much, and fantastic talk. Many of the companies you worked at have been rather large, as Microsoft and such. Many students will face much smaller type of companies when they emerge from, at least here in Sweden. Do you feel comfortable talking a little bit of what could possibly be different in a smaller company where there might not even be an employee handbook, for example?
Yeah, so the question is basically how are big companies, most of what I've talked about is with large companies, but how are smaller companies different? Two of the companies that I've worked for that weren't toxic, the only two companies I've worked for that I wouldn't classify as toxic were smaller companies. So sometimes smaller company culture is better, although it does, I also worked the longest hours at those companies because there was that whole like, well, we're a startup, if we don't all crunch constantly, we'll go under. But one of the most toxic companies I worked at was Paizo, which was like 50 employees. So it was not real large, and in that case, the thing with smaller companies is they tend to take their personality from their leadership even more than large companies, right? Because like a company like Microsoft that's been around forever has its own toxicity, but it also has like very clearly defined HR policies. At Paizo, most of the time I was there, we didn't even have an HR person. So like there wasn't really any recourse if you had an issue other than going to your manager, and what if your manager's the problem? There was no one else to go to. My problem was the CEO. You know, she was the one saying things like, well, you should be willing to work here for free. Well, at that point, what do, right? So smaller companies, it's just there's more variance, right? Like larger companies tend to be more afraid of getting sued. They tend to have more clear HR policies. There tends to at least be a process for recourse. A lot of times it's kind of fake, but at least you can register a complaint. Small companies, it's just a complete crapshoot.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello, and thank you for the speech. So one thing I wanted to just ask you, I used to work in San Francisco in the tech industry there, not necessarily the games industry, but in my time there, they had, there was a complaint lodged against me by another company. And after I was dragged into the manager's office that day, and then she said, okay, so we got this complaint about you, this is what they said, and it turned out all of the stuff that they had said was a lie, and the worst part was, I wasn't even in the office at the time.
Oof.
So how would you say to kind of avoid the kind of situations, if you can, where you are working in pair with another company, and then they try and blame their mistakes on you?
Document everything, and this goes for whether or not you are working with another company. Every time I have a hallway conversation in which something gets decided, I send an email to everybody who is involved and usually CC my manager and be like, okay, well, as we just talked about, and just kind of outline what the conversation was. You know, it's a shame that you have to constantly be thinking about creating a paper trail, but you do, right? Like, it has always turned out to be a mistake every time that I've been at a company and I haven't documented everything that went down, right? Like, you need that proof. You need the proof of like what you said, what they agreed to. Usually you can use the email, like it doesn't have to be, you don't have to make it clear that that's what you're doing. You can just like be like, I just want to be clear that we all agreed on, or I just want to be certain that everybody is on the same page as far as what we discussed and we all understand, you know, what the deliverables we agreed on, or, you know, what we're supposed to do. Like, you know, you said you were going to email this person, so like, please let me know when that's done so that I can then talk to this other person. Just document.
Thank you.
Sure.
So, do we have any more questions? No?
Did I scare everybody?
I think that's that. And then, thank you so much.
Oh, sure.
We call for lunch.
Awesome.